how do we engage our students when there is so much diversity in our classroom? Students with special needs, students with varying levels of competence and wide-ranging interests. I mean, what strategies can we use to perhaps bring the content closer to where they are so that we can take them to a higher level of engagement? Hi, my name is Edmund Chow. I'm the program leader in MA Arts Pedagogy and Practice here at LaSalle College of the Arts. In today's lecture, I thought maybe I'll share with you a concept called differentiated instruction, which is a pedagogy that is completely student-centered. All right? So it's a philosophy, a methodology in the classroom that allows the students to engage with the material based on their levels of interest, based on their levels and degrees of competence. So it can come from very different kinds of approach, and all of them will enter the content and enter the discourse in any way they want. And that in itself is quite difficult, because if students are going to choose whatever they want, and they may even suggest how they want to be assessed, this is going to be difficult to monitor and evaluate. And it might even suggest that we want to overhaul the curriculum, which we may not have the power to do so. All right? So in this applied arts matrix and a framework that I came up with, I want us to think about the kinds of things that we can do to make it more digestible, and how we can also differentiate certain parts of the classroom so that we can manage it better for ourselves in the classroom. All right, so a teacher engages the arts and design student through an artistic process to produce an artistic product, which could be a performance or could be some other kind of design that they need to come up with. But as we discover, each student is very different, right? They have very different cognitive processes, whether it's neural wiring or whether it's learning styles, or they may have very different attitudes, feelings, and interests around the topic that we have to teach. And then on top of that, right, the context of the family, of the school environment, and even the culture, right now with the COVID situation, it can affect and influence the way they learn and engage with the material, right? So all these things are affecting how we teach, and it's quite difficult and complex, and sometimes daunting to meet the needs of our individual students. So for the purposes of today's lecture, I thought maybe we should just focus on this area, because this area is something we could potentially manage to make it a little easier for us. And to do so, I thought I would introduce Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. All right, in this theory, Gardner says that we can allow students to enter the content in multiple ways. It also allows students to, with different ability levels and learning styles, to gain equal access to demonstrate mastery. So basically, he broke down this multiple intelligences into 8 dimensions, which I will share with you, right? Namely the visual, the spatial, auditory, kinesthetic, linguistic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalist dimensions. So let me just give you a very brief example of what I did when I was teaching literature in a secondary school years ago, and they had to read this text for O-levels. And in order to ensure my students read the novel, I had to break down the novel and chunk them into different chapters. And then I gave them a piece of homework to say that, you can have engagement with this chapter in different ways, up to based on your own levels of interest, or your skills, or your levels of your degrees of competence. So for example, they could represent the plot in a comic strip for those who are more artistically inclined or more visually oriented. And or they could map out the journey of the characters and look at it from a terrain or geography, looking at the measurements in terms of the distance they need to travel from one point to another point. Or they could even sing a song Maybe there's a theme song for this particular character or this particular scene. Next, for those who are more kinesthetic, more tactile, they could choreograph a fight scene between the characters. Or if they are more intrapersonal, they could pretend to be the character and write a diary, a personal journal of what happened, how you felt when you were undergoing that particular scene and you had that conflict with the other character. And then in response, how could you also write a letter to other characters to express how you felt, right? All these things, as you can see, somehow were quite linguistic because it relies on the written word. So the only issue I had at the time was to implement the Naturalist Dimension. But if I could make suggestions and turn back the clock, I could perhaps ask them to think of star signs. What kind of star signs represented this character, Aquarius, Capricorn, or Aries, Cancer, and how they really represented those stereotypes. Or if they were even more adventurous, I could ask them to identify the constellations that characterize the movements and tensions in the story. All right, so that could be the Naturalist Dimension. So I'm going to go through very quickly again these 8 dimensions and recommend strategies that you can use, and you can see how you can adapt it differently. All right, so in the visual spatial dimension, you could invite the students to draft a blueprint for the stage design. You could ask them to design a new interface that meets some of these criteria and requirements that you may lay out for them. Or you could map out, ask them to map out the routes or the flow. It's like a flow diagram, or do a Venn diagram, because to do that in an abstract way, they are able to see the interrelationships of the different variables or the different components that they need to think about, right, in an abstract way. They could create a template visually, like an infographic even. Next, in the logical mathematical dimension, they could calculate the costs, do a cost-benefit analysis, or they could propose a budget for this event, for this performance. It could be fictional, it can be real, it's up to you, right? They could even measure the design or the installation to scale, in order for them to do this artwork. What are the specific calculations that they need to take into consideration? Or if they're very logical, still in the same dimension, they could persuade funders how and why the project is important, right? Write down all these persuasive arguments in a deductive way. Or even perhaps write out the exact recipe and the procedures to teach someone else how to go about doing this, because it's a very logical process. All right, the third dimension is the auditory musical dimension. Again, I talked about that. You could invite them to compose a soundtrack for the scene, or maybe even a jingle for this product. They could even arrange the music using only 3 of these instruments, right? They could play a musical, play a musical instrument in response to this experience that you're going to introduce to them. Or they could sing in a different language, right? Make it a little difficult in terms of levels of difficulty to sing in a different language. So they now need to learn a different language and sing a song or hum a tune to represent something that's going on in this particular episode. Right, in the fourth dimension, the bodily kinesthetic dimension, in the multiple intelligences, they could choreograph the movements for this piece. They could represent the design of the story through dance. That would be interesting. They could also imitate movements and breath patterns of the characters, or to assemble and fix broken pieces. So this is a very tactile, kinesthetic engagement with the material. So even doing something, playing with clay and molding something, right? Maybe making a vase, making a statue, sculpting something using the hands would be a good way of engaging in a bodily kinesthetic way. All right, the next one is naturalist. I'm moving backwards. They could collect ideas or elements from nature, They could walk bare feet in the park, by the beach, photograph patterns, and then reproducing these textures and patterns back into the studio space, right? How can they represent that accurately, or maybe even in an abstract way? And how can we represent the rhythms also from the environment? So just being out in the open space. I had, for example, asked my students to go just around the campus to close their eyes and just listen to the sounds, what is happening in nature, in the cityscape, to represent the layering of sounds, the auditory kind of pattern in nature, and bring it back into the classroom, right? So that could be done as well. From an intrapersonal perspective, they could do a creative process journal. They could write a blog. They could write a reflection journal. They could even do a YouTube channel and talk about an Instagram page and talk about their reflections as a character, if you want. Or they can mark out their emotional journey. So for a person with intrapersonal intelligence, it's important to validate and legitimize their emotions and feelings, because they are very much always looking inwards. All right, so get them to talk about their feelings, whether again it's a fictional context or in a real context, it doesn't matter, but get them to acknowledge those feelings. The seventh multiple intelligence here is the interpersonal. So they could do something that involves some form of social organizing, because they like social interactions, right? Organize a social event, organize a performance, create a buddy system to work around this thing and solve a problem together. Or they could perhaps do some kind of ethnographic research that allows them to listen to another person's experiences, interviewing them, and try to do that in a documentary even, right? Document that process. How do you represent someone else's experiences? Because they like to have that engagement with someone else, right? So the interpersonal dimension really validates that kind of social space they are in, right? Of course, in a COVID context, we need to observe some form of social distancing. So for a person with interpersonal intelligence in a COVID situation, this is very difficult, right? Because especially on a Zoom context, it lacks that kind of interaction. So maybe having breakout sessions, getting them to talk one-on-one with each other would be a very helpful framework to work with, all right? And the linguistic dimension could be writing lyrics for an event, writing a proposal to secure funding for this gig, or to write a few taglines or a story to promote this event, or maybe to pen a sales letter. All right, anything to use the written word would be a great way for this particular learner into that particular thing, right? So if you take a look at this thing that you need to teach, a concept that they need to engage in, they can come from 8 different ways into the same thing, and then come together and let's discuss how many ways you could really explore this concept. One way to look at this MI theory, multiple intelligences, is to, in order to get in, I had this maxim, is for you to get out of it, right? To get out, to get in. So let me give an example. 2 cohorts ago, one of my MA students wanted to teach 3D printing, and he wanted to really get the students to acquire the confidence and to have the knowledge to operate the 3D printer. But they kept coming to him to want to know how to do it, the specific dimensions, what I need to do in this particular context. So in his thesis, he decided to look into designing a computer game so that he doesn't have to teach them the skills, but through playing a game, they acquire the knowledge and the skills to operate a 3D printer. But how do you do that? He needs to take them out of the context of a 3D printing context and make it into a game. So for example, right, in the game you need to have levels of difficulties. So in this particular context, he needed them to go through a kind of a journey to save, let's just say, the princess from prison, from the jail, right? But in order to get to that point, they need to acquire different skills, different equipment they need, the points system to like a credit system where they gain points to buy certain kinds of in exchange for some kind of a gadget, so that they can fight the monster guarding this particular prison. And in order for them to implement the specific knowledge to operate a 3D printer, right, he needs to translate it back into, say, I need to break open this jail, and I need to know, I need to create a key to unlock this thing, or to, to hack this particular steel, to break open this particular prison door. So I need to create something with a specific dimension, right? So as a character, I need to now create this tool to break open this thing with specific dimensions that are similar to the real 3D printing context. All right, so then he puts it into the obstacle, and the character now needs to replicate those specific dimensions and recreate a tool to break open the jail. So that's one way for the students to really engage, right? To get out of this real world context into a fictional context, and then come back in to apply it in the real world context. So I hope this has been helpful and useful in some way. Remember, if you are able to get them to enter this classroom, to engage the content in multiple ways, sometimes you need to create a fictional context to get them out before they can get back in. All right, so if you have any questions, feel free to write me an email, and I'll be happy to help you through your lesson delivery. All right, thank you very much for watching. See you. Bye.